Hey everyone, I'm Tim Mishak, and today I'm here with Andy Lurs. Andy and I are no longer on the WinDbg team, but we were on the Windows debugger team for many years together. And the two of us were the people that started the WinDbg Next project. So considering that WinDbg Next is now no longer beta, it's no longer WinDbg Preview, I thought we would record a little video. We'll talk about where WinDbg Next started, what we did. Do you want to introduce yourself, Andy?
Yeah, I'm Andy. I was the PM on it. The whole start of my career was working on WinDbg and debugging and all that type of stuff. And now I work on other things. I work in Edge. I work on other stuff. So it's a good time for us to sit back and talk and look back and think about what we would talk about, some of the decisions, some of the things people like, dislike. So
yeah. So Andy left the team, the debugger team, a few years back. I left the debugger team actually relatively recently. I left in beginning of January, and just a few weeks ago, last month, was when WinDbg Preview is now no longer Preview. It's now WinDbg. So I wasn't there for sort of that final, out of beta. But yeah,
they just got more work done without you there.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. You were just
I was holding them back. Yeah. So I figure we start by just talking about what is WinDbg Next. So it's been known by a lot of names, right? WinDbgX, WinDbg Next, WinDbg Preview,
dbgx.shell.exe.
dbgx.shell.exe. Still there.
That's right. That's the actual name.
dbgx.shell.exe. We actually went through a few names before we landed on WinDbg Next. We had a couple proposed names.
I'm trying to remember some of them.
So one of them was WinDbg++.
WinDbg++ was the one that we really wanted to do.
I thought that was pretty
funny.
It
would have been really good.
What others did we do?
I mean, later on we had joked about not naming it WinDbg. When we were saying how do we get out of WinDbg Preview without full Wind, we just kind of said can we just call it debug, or because we've added support for debugging Linux dumps and a few other types of things. Someone had joked LinDbg because it can debug Linux now, and that was a terrible idea. But then we just landed on no, we have to just call it WinDbg.
Yeah. So I think our plan was always that it would be called WinDbg eventually.
Yeah.
But when you're rewriting a product from scratch, we knew it wasn't going to be at parity with the old one for a long time. And so we knew they had to coexist for a while, so they would have to have its own name. So internally we started calling it WinDbg Next, and then I guess at the time there was sort of a trend of Microsoft products being called Preview. And there was was there Windows Terminal Preview?
It was it was right around, I think we were before Terminal Preview. There was just when we went out first time in public, it was Preview was the thing to do, and it was the easy way of saying WinDbg's 20 years old. We're not going to get parity with every single thing that every single person who's been doing for their entire career is going to do. So we're going to call it Preview, and we're going to get this out for most people who want it, and then deal with the little pieces later. We'd call it Insider, but that didn't feel right because Insider is
right.
So we just preview landed on it, and then
and then that became sort of a joke because it was in preview for
6 years or something like that.
6 years, yeah. So, and then just to kind of clarify what we're talking about with WinDbg Next. A lot of people, when they think about WinDbg Next, they also think about a lot of the other features and functionality we were working on at the same time. The data model had already existed when WinDbg Next started, but because WinDbg Next used the data model as its foundation for a lot of functionality.
And by data model, you mean the DX command.
The DX command, that's right.
The JavaScript scripting.
JavaScript scripting.
Yeah.
And so the two are kind of connected because we were working on them at the same time. But when we're talking about WinDbg Next, we're specifically talking about sort of the UI experience where we replaced the old UI, which was how many years, 30 years old or something like that.
I was so excited sometimes when someone would yell at me about a feature, and I just get to reply, this code was written before I was born. I really am not sure why they made the UI decisions that they made, but we're going to look at it improving in the future. And I had 3 or 4 times where I got to say that because there was just someone irately mad at me for one reason or another, and I got to just I was in diapers at best when this was written. Not my fault. Please don't act like it's my fault. I will we can do our best. And also TTD was the other thing that's most people have learned about TTD. Most people outside of Microsoft have learned about TTD alongside WinDbg Preview.
Yeah. TTD being time travel debugging, recording process execution and replaying it later.
Yeah, but it existed before in like a command line format, and so it's kind of the first user-friendly entry point to it.
Well, and it was also the first time that people saw outside of Microsoft,
Right,
for the
yeah.
most part. There had been papers published, the folks that had sort of written the initial, first version of time travel debugging. But in WinDbg Next, I think was the first, or WinDbg Preview was the first time that anybody had seen time travel debugging really outside the company.
But before that, it was kind of a mythical thing too, right? There were
Yeah.
people on Twitter that was like, I just had to use this like TT tracer thing to help an escalation engineer. I wonder what that is.
Yeah.
And then like they were like know roughly about it, so it was really cool to see that, like give that a vehicle that was really useful.
Yeah. So and that 30-year-old code base, or however many years old it was one of the big motivations for why we started WinDbg Next. It was just kind of impossible to add any new functionality into WinDbg at the time. It was, I mean, the legacy WinDbg code was literally written, the earliest versions of Windows when there were no such thing as a UI framework or toolkit or anything. A lot of that code was directly calling Win32 UI functions, create window, and just very manually creating all these things. And so adding anything was a nightmare.
Yeah. The one that I stuck with me a lot was we had just added the data model into things. We had the DX command, and we were like, oh, we could add this to the watch window.
Yeah.
And it was like, let's do it. Let's add that to the watch window. And we were like, I'm sitting there as a PM, like, this shouldn't be that bad. This seems like let's just use it, like, just evaluate a different expression. Yeah. There's got to be things for this. And you guys were like, it's like 3 months of work. It's like, what? Like, just to do, and it's like, that's like the basic, like, implement a thing, not even like a full on ship the feature. And we did that one, but it was like painful. And then there was JavaScript that come along.
Well, on the data model, integrating the data model into the old WinDbg, I think you were actually doing that while I was at VMware. So I left left Microsoft to go to VMware for about 1.5 years, and I came back to the debugger team. And I remember coming back to the debugger team, and I said, oh, this data model thing that had just started when I had left Microsoft the first time, that's connecting to the locals window. And I remember talking with you about what that took to get it in and how much work it was. And, that was one of the things I was thinking about, was we could make that so much easier if we just started from scratch for some of these pieces. And then you're saying about the JavaScript.
Yeah, so then we had the JavaScript stuff, and I was sitting there like, oh, we have this really cool JavaScript thing. That'd be so great if you had like a real workflow with IntelliSense and stuff. And then it was like, no, that's not even like remotely feasible to do. Like we had costed it, we had looked at it, and someone hacked together something, but you had looked into it too a little bit.
Yeah, so Bill Messmer, who was the architect who did the data model, JavaScript scripting, and really a lot of the core engine features that were, pretty amazing at the time, he had spent some time bringing the script window into the legacy WinDbg, and it took him a long time. And it was, he's an amazing programmer, amazing coder, and it still took him a long time for something that was just honestly pretty mediocre.
Yeah. No fault of his.
No fault of his. It was just a very, very hard code base to work with. So we had actually, I think, had some meetings, and we were just talking before. I think maybe Andy wasn't in this meeting, but we had a meeting that was discussing what should we do about this legacy code base. And there were, a couple obvious, answers that we could consider or possible solutions. One of them was to start from scratch. One of them was to sort of do an incremental update to WinDbg where we take specific windows and modernize each window, and then maybe we do some things on the window manager and just sort of do things very incrementally. And then there was a third option, which was to integrate the debugger engine into the Visual Studio UI. And that was actually a project that I had basically done something like that when I was a junior engineer at Microsoft, and it was a bad product. It was just very bad. At the time, it was fitting a square peg into a round hole. The more modern, APIs now for plugging into Visual Studio, that would not be the case. But I was very much traumatized by the experience of like trying to plug the WinDbg debugging engine and kernel debugging into Visual Studio, which was not designed for the types of things that our kernel debugger expected. And so I wasn't really willing to go down that road at the time.
That product, that was 2012
when it shipped.
When you wrote that, yeah.
Possibly longer ago than that. probably
Yeah.
2010
So
or something.
yeah, that's
before
like,
you were even at the company.
that was before I was even at the company, and that was like, so that's an entirely different Visual Studio than what's out today.
Yes,
Like,
very, very different. I think it was
way-
working. Yeah, it was probably maybe it was VS 2012. And that shipped. That was in the driver development kit. WDK, yes, it was in the WDK. And I don't know when it stopped existing, but that product had a lot of problems. But it did work sort of at a core level. You could do driver debugging from Visual Studio, and it kind of worked. But I also had done enough work on it to know it would still be hard for us to go and make new features. And so at the time, we decided we were going to do incremental work on WinDbg. We would swap out window by window, and we would just sort of, I had a prototype that would bring in some .NET in as for a very specific window. And we had a big meeting with all all the devs on the team, at least, and that was kind of the decision that we had done. And I agree with it, but I wasn't thrilled. I would have liked to start from scratch. So December of, what year did we figure that was?
2015.
December of 2015. I had some time off, and as was the tradition, and probably still is the tradition of the debugger team, time off sometimes results in some very cool features being implemented. And so I spent a chunk of December, I had probably 2-3 weeks off. I spent a chunk of that just making a prototype for a new WinDbg. And it was really, really basic. It was written in .NET. It was, I think even then, it was WPF. And it had a grid of 4 windows.
Well, the first one had 2 windows.
The first one had 2 windows. It was command window and source.
Command window and source window. Both were HTML. And
both were HTML. Well, source window I think was just text to start with before we switched over to
had the commit in
Monaco.
front. It was Monaco in.
Was it Monaco early? Because I think Nick brought Monaco in.
It was Monaco in December.
It was Monaco in December.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So we brought Monaco in pretty early. So Monaco is the text source control that VS Code uses, and even back then it was open source. So we were able to bring that in and use that for the source window. And then the command window was also a web browser control, it was HTML. So it was just 2 windows, but it was a proof of concept. It was like, yeah, we can write a debugger in .NET. A lot of people did not think it was even possible at the time.
Yeah.
And then I brought it in, and I probably showed you before I got back to work, but I think you and I started talking about it.
Yeah, we had started talking about it because I was also kind of, so like as a PM, it was for me to look at something like WinDbg. There's so much room for opportunity. There's so many ways to improve the productivity of engineers, make them faster, make them do their jobs better, and just like bringing up like the expectation of like the source window was so bare bones, that everything was so bare bones that there's so many little things that you could add, but when those cost so much to implement, it's just hard to get the cost benefit right. So I was really interested in this from the perspective of like, you had a better source window working. And for a lot of people, especially at Microsoft, who love like the command line experience, having that source window and command window, if those work and those work well, they would love that and they would jump into it. So you had showed me that. I was like, yeah, let's like, what do you need from me? And we had gone from there and started talking to, this was my favorite part of doing user research, was the start of WinDbg Next, because like one of the PM things is like your target audience is, not necessarily the people you talk to the most. Be careful about that type of thing. But for WinDbg, it's kind of I can just throw a rock in Redmond and hit someone who is probably near WinDbg's target audience. So I was able to take these builds where just like 2 windows, take it to some developers and say, hey, what do you think of this? And I had 1 or 2 that were like, I can keep using this, right? Like I'd given them like a build off of a USB drive, and I was like, hey, let's try it out. And they kept using it because they liked it so much. And it was just, they just need a command window and a source window to start. And that experience was already so much better with just the 2 things that you had done.
Yeah, I remember early on, I think you were just, your brain was going wild with the directions that we go. And I think, in the beginning, we just saw how quick we could bring up some of the basic, core bare bones functionality, and we were moving really fast. We had, in the first month, I think we had pretty much all the main source window or source windows, stack window, command window, threads.
So it was basically in January we had the 2 window experience that I was able to go.
January 2016.
Yeah, and we were able to convince Jordy and a couple other people that like let's just let Tim do his thing for a bit and see how this goes. Like we can get together, something that I can then get user research on and we can really justify more strongly.
Yeah, and Jordy was the dev lead at the time. I was a senior IC.
Yeah,
team.
and then February we had basically the full experience for the data model windows we had set at the time, which was like so locals, watch, registers, the ones you were saying. We didn't have memory and disassembly. Those were like
Those took a while.
those took a while to get them right,
Yeah.
and they're also a little bit more niche of an experience, so we were okay doing that. And then I ran around and talked to probably dozens of developers in February, and then every month after that, where I would get to do these observational sessions where it's just like, I'm gonna run this program and just do your job for a bit and talk while you do it. And that's my favorite type of user research. And it was so effective because there were people that were just like, oh yeah, this is okay, yeah, I like this. And just like doing things and like, oh, I hit up arrow, left, right, left, up, down, and it did this in WinDbg, but doesn't do it anymore. And I was like, okay, that's not important. And like 4 people would say the same thing where they had this arcane syntax for doing something. So we ended up just kind of going in the 2 directions of like, we knew the bare bones things we needed to do. And that was through March or April, probably we had that approach. And we were able to get things in fast and get things going. And like, that was the key to getting it rolling, really.
Yeah, and I think pretty early on we made a couple of decisions that I think were really, really important. And the one that I always think about because I think we would never have made progress so quickly was automatic updates.
Yeah.
That was key. But I think equally important was our feedback mechanism.
Yeah.
We made it incredibly easy for people to send us feedback. And I had come from a team that owned a tool that was called Send a Smile. And that was kind of a common feedback mechanism, I think, at the time, was people would just have a little, I think there's still products that have that, where there's a little smile and it would send us. And I decided that what we were going to do is we're going to send direct emails to the team. And we were going to, for internal users, it would send a direct email. And we had automatic updates. And so, and we had a good, engineering system where we could get builds out very quickly. And so that was really just the very tight loop between customers and releasing. And I think that was incredibly important for us to just be able to gain mind share and confidence from people that we were actively working on things and trying to make a good debugger for everyone.
Right. And it was really helpful in those like death by 1,000 cuts where it's not like what they wanted to do was difficult or anything. It was like Alt-1 shows focuses the text box on like the input on the command window is something that a lot of people did that like, obviously, if we sat down and like looked at every single thing people could do, that would have probably popped up pretty quickly. But it was one that like we got one of that type of feedback where it's like this key combinations or just this workflows that people have, where we were able to get a frown and then literally 10 minutes later sometimes say updated build, hit update, and you're good.
And that made so many people happy.
And it made people happy from the perspective of it just fixed things and made things like, wow, I can send feedback and get it fixed, but also set up that virtuous cycle of these people who like most people send feedback on products and they get lack of response leads to diminishing, like, I'm not going to bother. Like you send feedback with like, here's a 2-page bug report. And then you're like, that's on our backlog. And then like the next bug report you do is going to be a paragraph. And the next bug report is going to be, a sentence. And the next one's not going to happen. So when we had this, we'd have these people, like there were 4 or 5 people probably who were really just going through and sending feedback. And then we found out that when we would answer some of those, we would get follow-ups like off, like in meetings or in passing where someone's like, hey, I saw you guys added this feature. Thank you. And then we'd be like, send a frown, please. And we would have fixed it when it bothered you.
Yeah.
And I would do presentations about like some new features we added. And the first thing I would say in every presentation would be, if you had a problem, send a frown and we'll respond to it instantly. And sometimes I would have it set up to have my inbox show up in presentations. I don't know if I've even told you this. So I'd be giving a presentation and I'd get an email on the bottom right, frown from so-and-so. And so I'd be giving a presentation and you would see a frown pop up. And there was one meeting where I had a frown pop up. And then during that presentation, the reply saying, hey, this is fixed popped up. And I got to click it and say, like, look, like Tim fixed it. Like this guy sent this frown at the start of this meeting and it got fixed by the time this meeting was over. And that was amazing. But it also set up for some problems later on.
Right.
We had more of just like, I was a very junior PM at the time. I was a PM too. I had been, I like to think I'm good at my job, but I hadn't done a lot of like stakeholder management outside of customers with something like this. It was my first like bringing it up from the ground. So whenever we added stuff, we talked about it a lot, right? We sent out like, hey, we got this new, we added these hotkeys, we did this, we had really good release notes, we talked to people. And then we got kind of through the easy stuff. Like we got to the harder parts and harder, like, and so we had this like throughput that was just massive for a while because we were building easier things. We were doing basics. And then when we started adding smaller features, it started to look like we were going much slower. And after a while, we were kind of like, I think we said like 80% of stuff was done in 20% of the time, and so quickly in this like first year. And it's been
And then
like
we had to work on the other
60%.
80%.
We had to work on the other 80% or 20% or however much that breaks down.
Yep.
And that was just an interesting experience of like setting the expectation about like with the right managers and the right people involved, like, hey, we're going fast because we're doing easy stuff. Not to sell ourselves short, but just to set the expectation. It's not going to keep going like this.
But and we still had times where, and you know, to come back to the script window example, actually, I think that was a key part where we really kind of got a lot of buy-in on our own team and from our management chain, because we had, you know, on the old WinDbg, we had a very competent, very senior developer who was able to make something that was okay, and it took a lot of time. And then we brought in a very junior developer. This is Nick. We brought Nick in, and he was, I mean, he was not that junior, but he was not, you know, much less experienced than Bill. And he was able to turn around and create a very functional script window. I want to say it was about a week. Does that sound about right? Maybe 2 weeks that he went from starting on the project to he had something that was functioning.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I would need to look more, but I think it was about 2 weeks. And then that one, I love the script one as an example too, because no one, like, it's such a small amount of people that need the script window, but the people who need it really need it.
Yeah. And that really helped us get sort of a core set of customers that there was literally no equivalent in WinDbg. And we were in the old WinDbg, we were always trying to reach parity on the old WinDbg, but we also realized we needed to have some very specific WinDbg Next features that was only in WinDbg Next that we couldn't even do in the old WinDbg.
Yeah.
And TTD, the script window was the first one.
Yeah, and then TTD was the biggest one,
that's
probably
right.
Externally around, like, biggest reason to use it.
Yeah, actually, that's true. I think around late spring, early summer, we were working on integrating time travel debugging into WinDbg Next. Sort of an end-to-end experience of like attach to a process or launch a process under TTD, collect the trace, and open it. And that streamlined process. Actually, there had been other people that have written tools to sort of streamline it.
Yeah.
But it was not integrated into the debugger. And of course, time travel debugging had never been outside Microsoft either.
Yeah.
So that was another feature that people come to WinDbg Next for. You know, even internally, just to have that streamlined tracing experience.
Yeah.
So the direct feedback that we got from people, I thought was really great, but it came with kind of some negative aspects too, I think. A lot of people are used to feedback systems, I think, where you're, you know, shouting it to the abyss. It's not directly going to anybody. And so there were definitely some cases where people would send some, I'm just going to say, unprofessional feedback. It got pretty bad.
I mean, there were some where it was kind of, most of them were very, very quick to be like, oh, oops. And there's empathy there that like all of the times that we had feedback, we were like, ooh, like almost all of those, we were able to respond with empathy and get the right direction, because it's like, if someone's just cussing you out, it's like, hey man, like I get that it's frustrating when your tools don't work. Let's work with you on this, but also maybe just be nice.
I didn't have to do that too much of like tell people like, hey, there's real people on the end of this, but it was always very kind of satisfying when people come with like kind of rude feedback, and then we would turn around and fix it quickly, and then they'd be like, oh my gosh, thank you so much.
I love that direction. So the other part of this, earlier I was saying about the best part of user research is that I could like throw a rock and hit someone and I can do user research on. It's also very much a negative, because like the people who are frustrated know that they know where our offices are. And they can come and knock on our door.
They know where to throw the rocks back.
They know where to throw the rocks back. And I was going to reply to this. There was a tweet a couple weeks ago. Someone was talking about all the different types of development, where it's like, oh, there's test-driven development and there's scenario-driven development. And we had a joke every once in a while. We had spike-driven development. It was every once in a while where just someone would send us something and it's like a really trivial thing for us to implement. And they would send us this really long thing that was just a big problem. And we'd just be like, should we just prioritize this to just like out of spite?
And yeah, I mean, there are definitely some times where we get some long complaining email, and then me or Nick or somebody else would just respond to like, yeah, fixed it.
Yeah.
Hit update, we fixed it.
And again, the empathy there of like most of the time it would come back in such a way that the person would come back and be like, oh, cool, thank you. Sorry for my previous thing. And most of the time it was like, I just had a 45-minute build and this happened and this happened and I got blue screen and I got blah and I'm in the zone. I'm in the zone. I have 7 breakpoints and then WinDbg crashes.
WinDbg crashes,
like,
and you're like, I get it. That's frustrating.
Yeah. So the other thing we missed in terms of what made success, by the way, that we didn't talk about was contributions.
That's right.
And
very early on.
This does feel weird to talk about in like a public thing, but it is important to the success of like pretty much anyone inside of Microsoft can just send a like can contribute to the code.
Yeah, and we made that really clear early on.
And a lot of our feedback made that really clear. If someone sent us something frustrated or sent us a request, we could like it wasn't just yes, we'll put it on our backlog. You and the team did a very good job of like, hey, it's it's on our backlog. Here's why we can't get to it right now. It should be pretty easy to contribute. It's right here. If you want to set up 30 minutes, we can talk you through what you probably like the general places where you need to change things. And correct me if I'm wrong, command window highlighting came through that, didn't it?
Yeah, so command window highlighting is an interesting one.
So what we mean by command window highlighting, because not a lot of people know this, you control double click on a value, and there's a few other ways to do it. There's a ribbon tab for it. In the command window, it'll highlight all the instances of that, which is extremely helpful when you're trying to find a memory address. If that memory address pops up a bunch of anymore in the future, that type of thing. It's kind of a hidden feature that still bugs me that it's so hidden. But when people find it and love it, they use it a lot. But it's also it's such a niche behavior to get it right too, though, because it's like 0x FFFFF. Do you just highlight that, or do you highlight it if it's expanded out to 16 bits, or do you highlight it out if it's a different hex interpretation? You highlight the decimal version. And that one came in. We're like, we really want to do this, but we don't really have the cycles, and we got contributions there.
Yeah, and that one's kind of interesting. So that one existed in sort of a weird way in the legacy WinDbg. There was a group of folks, I believe it was the escalation engineers, had written a debugger extension, and one of the features of this debugger extension was to add this highlighting feature into the legacy WinDbg. And when I first saw this feature, I'm like, that's not possible. There's no extension API for this. I don't know how they're doing this. And I went and I looked at what they were doing, and I realized that they were reaching into the internals of legacy WinDbg, and they were mucking around with our command window. And I looked at that and I'm like, that's horrible, but I understand why you did it, because there was no way to do this. And that was also, I won't go on this tangent, that was also one of the things that started my thinking around making UI extensibility and that sort of stuff. But so, we get into WinDbg Next, and early on, some of these escalation engineers say, where's my highlighting feature? It doesn't work. I say, well, funny you mention that. It'll never work because of the way it was written. But then we had an escalation engineer, Mihai.
It was Mihai,
Mihai, who I think is still at Microsoft. And he said, hey, I really like this feature. I like contributing to the debugger. I like contributing to these things. Can I implement this? And we said, sure, go for it. And our team did some work on it as well, and we did the matching of different number formats and everything. But that was contributed outside, and part of it was our philosophy of being just very open inside the company with people that wanted to contribute. And that, like you said, that I think really contributed to our success. Also gave people sort of a sense of like ownership and responsibility. We had so many contributions over the years, mostly bug fixes, very rarely a feature of that size. So we got some pretty negative feedback at times, and I think some of it had to do with some of the decisions that we made pretty early on. And there's one specific controversial decision that probably created more negative feedback than anything else in the debugger. And I think
I don't know what you're talking about.
Do you?
I don't really think there was any negative feedback at all.
No.
Feedback. I think everyone loved how they interacted with WinDbg, and I don't think there were any controversial decisions. Like maybe are you talking about the ribbon?
Oh, we can get to the ribbon, but I was
talking about.
I was talking about the redirect.
Oh, you were talking about the redirect. I was
Yeah,
talking
that
about the
was
ribbon. I was joking about the ribbon.
okay. So the ribbon is probably number 2. I think we got more
So,
angry feedback. I
for-
think about the redirect than
For
anything else.
internal people, redirect. For external people, ribbon.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
So
okay, yeah, go through the redirect.
okay,
The
so
redirect is
redirect.
controversial, but
So one of the things that we want to do is make sure that it was easy for people once they had installed the new version of the debugger, once they installed WinDbg Next, wanted to make sure that it was easy for them to continue using it. And so what we did, since a lot of tools were hard coded to look for WinDbg.exe in a specific path, either C drive debuggers slash WinDbg, we added a redirect in the legacy WinDbg so that we look to see, oh, do you have the new one installed? If so, go redirect to the new WinDbg. And we wanted to make it easy for people to say, yeah, I'm on the new WinDbg, any tools that were using the old one, or if I have muscle memory that's set in WinDbg, go to the new one. And we made it possible to opt out, where there was a registry key you could set, or a setting you could do.
command line flag.
Command line flag, -- no redirect or something like that. A lot of people got very upset about this. Got some very angry feedback around this.
Yeah, and that was another, like, that was a good one where we replied with, like, we got good feedback from that, though. Like,
well, and we told people, here's how you opt out, but if you opt out, please tell us why, so that we can fix this.
And that was probably I don't know when we added that. That was after, like, that must have been 6 or 7, like, that must have been about a year in when we added the redirect.
Yeah, it was probably about a year in.
And
because we didn't want to do that until we actually felt like we had a product that could be usable for some people.
Yeah, and we had been, like, I had gotten confident in my user research there, so that was really exciting for me. Because, so you think about it as a negative, that's why I didn't actually, that's why I was thinking about the ribbon and not the redirect, because I thought about that as positive.
Well, we got a lot of negative feedback.
We got a lot of negative feedback, yeah.
Yeah.
And I love that, though, because that just let me, like, oh, cool, like, you think it's hurting your productivity, can I just watch you use the old WinDbg for an hour?
Yeah.
And people would be sending us these angry things, and they'd be like, I'd watch them for an hour, and they're walking me through, and there were a good chunk of people that were mad about this, that I was like, can I talk to you for, like, can I sales pitch you for 5 or 15 minutes about everything you just did that was wrong? And I obviously didn't phrase it that way, but, like, why actually you do want WinDbg Next, and here's why it's better. Because there were a few where it's just like they're hunting for buttons on the toolbar, they're hitting file menus slowly, they're doing these things that are just like suboptimal, that, like, oh, I lost 10 seconds. But if you do it 1,000 times a day or 1,000 times a month, you're losing a lot of productivity. So it was really cool to have that level of feedback where people got mad at us about it, but we translated that into another, like, push of energy.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are probably still people that are might stew about it, or still remember how we were.
Mm-hmm.
They might see it as user hostile, but honestly, like you said, I think it drove the feedback we needed to get it.
Yeah,
like we were never going to replace the old WinDbg if we didn't start pushing on it harder. And even then, you look at how many years it took.
Yeah.
We started in essentially 2016, and it didn't release until 2023.
Yeah.
Right. So 7 years in beta. Right.
Yeah. So, okay, my controversial decision then was the ribbon. The ribbon was the one that I remember I did a talk at Build in, I guess it was 2017, 2018 maybe.
Oh, you talked about it at Build?
You don't remember?
I vaguely remember.
I had a talk at Build. I talked about WinDbg. I talked about WinDbg Next.
This was when we released it.
It was
summer
2016 after we released it.
Okay. Because okay, yeah.
And it was a 30-minute, like, lightning talk where I blew through a ton of WinDbg features, including the ribbon and the value of the ribbon. And so many people talked to me afterwards about why the ribbon is so bad.
Yeah. And
almost all of them, I remember I had a screenshot that I had saved on my desktop, because it's a screenshot of WinDbg's taskbar, like the toolbar in WinDbg. And I would ask someone, oh, you use hotkeys for everything, and instead of, like, you use hotkeys or you click things? And it was either, I use hotkeys. It's like, okay, double click the ribbon and it'll collapse it, and then you don't have to worry about it. It's the same thing. It's out of your way. And there are people like, oh, I click. And I didn't do this a lot, again, and I had to have the right tone. I wouldn't do it in a super condescending way. I would kind of just show them the photo. What does this button do? And I would point to the button that's jump to source line. Yeah. And I would point to step over or step out. One of the step buttons is just a terrible icon.
Yeah. In the legacy WinDbg.
In the legacy WinDbg. Yeah. And almost no one could name like what buttons were. They all had to go up and hover over it, see the tooltip. Not all of them, many of them. Hover over, see the context menu, tooltip, click it. And I'm like, so you're doing the same thing but slower. And they're like, well, yeah, I guess so. I've never thought about it. And it's one of those things that like once you have a change, you move the cheese and then you might have to think about it a little bit and realize it's better.
So you wouldn't change that decision. Still do the ribbon. Was that the right decision?
I don't think we got to take it far enough. I think if I knew where it was today, it would be a harder decision because the other thing about the ribbon is the context and the extensibility of it that could go if you have the script window open, for example. Like there's a whole ribbon for the script window, and that's useful and better. We had ideas for how we could do more, and obviously it can still grow, but it didn't grow nearly as fast as it could have gone or it could have grown. So it'd be a hard decision. A lot of people pointed to Visual Studio as like, Visual Studio doesn't use the ribbon, why do you need to? And it's a pretty drastically different use case and a drastically different, like, they aren't rewriting from scratch. If they rewrote from scratch, maybe that is something that they would do.
Yeah, and it's funny because Visual Studio we got compared to a lot, and I'm sure there are still people that don't understand why Microsoft makes two different, well, more than two debuggers, but two pretty full feature debuggers. And there were a camp of people inside Microsoft that were like, you guys are idiots for not just integrating into Visual Studio. And then there was another camp of people that were saying, you guys are idiots for even trying to come close. Like, you shouldn't even be like copying anything. Like, WinDbg is supposed to be simple and
into the second camp, we were able to pretty much be like, well, you want CDB, you don't want WinDbg. And most of them were like, yes. It's like, okay,
we're not getting rid of CDB.
Not the target audience. The Visual Studio audience was so weird to me. We were able to kind of fight that. Like, we didn't have to fight that battle too much because escalation engineers fought it for us.
Yeah, I mean, and WinDbg is a product that is really kind of weird in that there are internal users at Microsoft and external users at Microsoft, or external users outside of Microsoft. But in terms of like the ratio of internal to external people, it was a very high percent of internal users compared to external. And that's something that, there were more external users of WinDbg, but as a ratio, it was pretty high percent internal.
Yeah, and in the external ones tend toward a different user base, right?
User base.
Like there's driver developers, obviously. Yep. That's basically the exact same as internal for most, except for symbols. Right. It's basically the same thing. And then there's like reverse engineering, security, that type of stuff, which there is a good group internally that do that, but they do it with private symbols more and that type of stuff. So
yeah, and they're doing it. And the people that are doing security analysis or reverse engineering have entirely different workflows from driver developers or from kernel engineers. And then there's a third group of support engineers who have an entirely different workflow from them as well.
Support engineers they're almost both.
They are, but they also because they're sometimes debugging without source code, or sometimes debugging code that they didn't write, right?
Yeah.
But they're also, it's a different mentality around how you debug things when you're not debugging your own code, or you're not debugging something that's just like, it's malware, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, overlaps, of course.
Yeah, we should do a whole nother recording. We could do a whole nother recording on like philosophy, because I never talk about debugging. I still, like, my current job has me working in reliability, performance, that type of like debugging-ish related. I almost never talk about debugging as a concept. I always talk about code understanding is the way that I phrase it, because it's all like, that's all debugging is. You're not debugging with a debugger is not removing bugs. It's efficiently understanding what the code is doing.
Right. And we certainly had a very specific way of looking at things because, I came from a WinDbg background, but, both of us have moved on. I now work on services where logs are a big chunk of what I do in terms of how I debug, in terms of how I understand code execution and system behavior. And you also have.
Yeah, I work on, for those that don't know, I work on WebView 2 from Microsoft Edge WebView 2, which is apps that are native apps embedding web stuff. And many of the complex ones have so much interop and back and forth that it's a drastically different experience from doing either of those separately. You have to do them both together sometimes. You have to do them separately. And like understanding what the other half is doing is such a big thing. And it's not necessarily debugging, it's understanding. And I entirely tangented from a point you were making when I brought that up.
That's okay. We get back on track. we were talking about some controversial decisions.
Wait, no,
that
I
we
want to
made.
finish my ribbon.
All right. Oh yeah. The ribbon.
Biggest thing that the ribbon brought us as controversial wasn't necessarily the ribbon itself. So the ribbon itself was great for pretty much everyone involved. Like I could dig up my PowerPoint on it where I was proud of that. User research, everything showed that like the ribbon was better. If you didn't want it, you could collapse it and you would have more vertical space. So that was a lot of people's concern, was the vertical space. So once you got used to the movement, there's not too many buttons that move. So once you got used to it, you're fine. But the thing that we did bit gain was the file menu.
Yes.
That like the outspace, I think is what it's called in the ribbon context. Like the attached dialog is now so much better.
Yeah.
The thing that we didn't even talk about in terms of early useful features that we both of us just missed when we were talking about this earlier.
Yeah.
UWP.
Yeah, that's right. We had an experience for launching UWP or other packaged apps.
Yeah.
It was a really painful experience before. I mean, Visual Studio had an experience, of course, but if you needed to debug something in WinDbg, there was a tool, PLM Debug, where you go and configure it to start a debug, start something under the debugger. And then eventually we added, legacy WinDbg had some command line options that were like, launch this UWP, but you would still have to go and like find the exact parameters to pass, and
it's not like a single string. It's like some
it's multiple strings
package
usually,
ID.
package ID and an app name or something like that. And so like pretty early on, that was I think in the first year we had our.
It was really early because it was around.
Right.
It was 20.
It was before build conference.
It was right around Win 10. It was UWP was going strong, and that was a selling feature for a lot of the escalation engineer types because they had to deal with these UWP apps, and there was no great way for them to do their normal workflows on it.
Yeah.
So we had tangented away. We had talked about personas per like people types.
That's right.
That's where we tangented. Popping off the stack. Like escalation engineers were huge because like you can't just install Visual Studio on a production server to debug stuff. So we had that like benefit of whenever anyone was trying to push for one debugger only, that persona was just huge. And they are the like I always think that escalate, like if you want to learn how to understand code, if you want to learn how to understand the internals of systems, like escalation engineers do it best. There are escalation engineers who can debug code better than the people who wrote it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's
no
insane.
question. And that was another video that I did. I did a video with Jason Epperly. So,
did you do one, Jason?
I did, yeah. So anybody watching on my YouTube channel, go check. I did an interview with Jason Epperly. Brilliant guy. He is what we would call at Microsoft an escalation engineer, although I think his title may have changed at this point. But he talks about his philosophy around how do you debug these deep problems. Yeah, I also did an interview with Ivan Ruzanov, who I don't know that he was actually an escalation engineer at Microsoft. He did work at Microsoft, but the way he does at Intel is a somewhat similar role in terms of debugging. And I've asked people, what's the equivalent of this role at your company? And there's a million different names, but it's these people that specialize in debugging and understanding code. And at Microsoft, a lot of people that are support engineers or escalation engineers that are just debugging gurus. That's their whole job.
Yeah. Okay, so what would you do different was the other thing we wanted to say.
Right. So on the ribbon, I think the answer was maybe if you knew what you know today, maybe not.
Yeah, it would be a harder decision.
It'd be a hard decision. So in terms of controversial decisions, one that got a lot of feedback.
Yes.
Mostly external people.
Well, obviously.
Was shipping through the store.
Yeah. So
shipping through the Microsoft store, not shipping an MSI, not having not in the SDK or WDK, but shipping through the store.
And that one was, we made that decision for the similar reasons you've talked about already.
Yeah, the automatic updates.
Not having to worry about it, being able to ship fast.
Yep.
We didn't ship as fast in the store. We shipped monthly instead of continuous integration.
Mm-hmm.
And that was controversial. I don't know if we probably should have done something different.
So I think at the time it was the best option that we had because we couldn't get a beta product into the SDK. I think at the time there was a big, I won't say red tape, but there was a higher bar.
And again, that time we shipped Windows moves a lot faster today than they did back then. SDK releases were like every 6 months or something like that. So if we wanted to ship in the SDK in like the correct release vehicle, it would have been way slower.
Yeah. I mean, while we were on the team, WinDbg went from, well, I think it had already gone to a monthly release by the time you had joined the team. But we went from a yearly release to a monthly release to, at some point we just decided we're like, people should be using our daily builds, especially with the WinDbg Next, where we could fix it out to people quickly.
Yeah. So I feel like we probably should have been a little bit more aggressive on that one.
Yeah. You mean getting it available to people outside of the Windows Store?
Getting some installer available.
That took too long.
Yeah.
It took years.
But I don't know if I would say that's like a fault of our own. That's kind of a...
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, I feel like we had the ability of having an Apex package debugger without having the store. And I think at that point, we really should have probably pushed a little harder.
Yeah, it was like when Terminal was going out.
Around that time,
we had like looked at that and we talked about it, and then we kind of...
There wasn't another product that had gone through a similar evolution. And so we were kind of in uncharted territory from a like Microsoft policy, Microsoft position, and so I think it was really hard. But there had been tools that shipped in the store.
Yeah.
Right. We were one of the early ones. WPA also ended up in the store and other tools. But it was a little hard. Actually, when I had joined the team originally in years ago, it was like WinDbg had its own MSI just on MSDN. And the team had their own control of the ship cycle. And there was a big change that said, we shouldn't have 100 different MSIs just floating around on Microsoft's website, which was a valid statement. But it meant that for a long time, it was like WinDbg was bundled with something bigger.
Yeah.
Right. Whether it was the WDK or, whatever.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's when I would change, but.
Just push faster to get out of the store. Because there were people that literally could not use the store. Like their enterprise blocked the store. Or
and there are like two levels of feedback. There's like, I physically cannot. And those ones felt bad and we really tried to do our best. And then there are ones that were just condescending, like people who use WinDbg don't use the store. Which, is just, demonstrably not true.
So one thing that I think about a lot is we started out with a lot of web technologies in Windows. We had the source window was an HTML control. It was Monaco. It was the VS Code window. The script window was also Monaco based. Is still Monaco based. The source window is no longer based on Monaco. The command window originally was web based. Was a little web browser control with all the commands that you typed and everything. And that eventually transitioned away from web technologies as well. And I think the biggest reason that we had to do that was because the performance wasn't good at the time. Partly because we were trying to integrate WPF and web technologies. And in hindsight, I still don't know that I would ever have done that.
Someone should work on
that. I don't think it would have been the right choice at the time. I think given the state of the world, WinDbg should not have been an Electron app. That was not the right thing. It should not be an Electron app. These days, though, I look at what technologies we have, and honestly, if I was rewriting WinDbg again today, and I'm a little bit biased, I think, by recent experiences, I would write it in Rust with Tori and do web technologies for all of the front end, and I would use Rust to talk to the debugger. That's probably what I would try.
I just want to let everyone know that this is the first time he's saying this to me. This isn't a pitch on my technology or anything.
That's right.
So he's told me this.
Yes.
Tori uses WebView 2
on Windows. Tori
because it's amazing and it's great.
It is amazing and great because it has a great PM report. And Tori, is cross-platform. It'll use WebView 2 on Windows. It'll use WebKit on Safari, I guess, and then
WebKit WK.
And then it works on Linux as well and uses the native WebView. And so it's different from Electron in that you don't bring the whole browser with you.
Yeah.
And I also really like how it integrates with Rust. It's got a very nice layer that talks with Rust. That's probably what I would do today. Given what I know now, but I didn't have that option.
So given what you know now, you would have waited until Rust
I would have waited
existed.
10 years
Waited until
until
Rust existed,
existed,
then waited until Tori existed, and then done it.
And then
That
done it,
would have
yeah.
been the right thing to do. Yeah, I can't argue with that. I like that idea. I have my, you can clearly see my where's my JavaScript sticker.
Yeah.
Like I wonder how much we would have been able to do it if we had someone paying attention to the web perf, because what I like, this is just now going into like my day job and normal stuff. Like the perf of web view controls tends to be tied more tightly to the website than people realize. And I think we were trying to cram a little bit too much into like the command window gets huge, that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And Monaco's gotten a lot better since then too.
Yeah.
Monaco was still like only really used in when was VS Code released? Like it was pretty early still.
Well, and also we were spinning up for every single source window that you had. We were spinning up a separate web browser control.
Yeah, and we would have been able to do that. Yeah.
We would never, if it was not integrating web and WPF, it would not have had that problem. So, but again, you know, at the time, and I think there's still kind of this problem of like, what UI toolkit do you use on Windows?
Yeah.
WPF made sense at the time.
So VS Code was released in 2016, by the way.
2016. Oh, so we were like really early.
Monaco at the time was, I know Monaco came before VS Code. But it was still young enough that it probably is way better now in terms of performance.
I don't know that there are any specific Monaco problems. I think it was most of the performance of like you're spinning up a new web browser every time you're opening a tab. And we had cases where you were using 4 gigs of RAM just from source windows.
Yes, and WebView 2 handles all that much better now. Yeah. So things I would have done differently, and this is just entirely like, I would just like, if anyone on the WinDbg team now is watching, I will help justify things. The notes experience. WinDbg has a notes window, and there's a few things that I don't remember exactly how it works, and I haven't looked at it recently. Like the biggest thing that happened to me during all of this user research about things we couldn't justify prioritizing, and I still probably can't justify prioritizing, is this like notes and handoff experience, especially when we talk about these like escalation engineer types and that type of thing. Everyone has some sort of way to take notes when they are debugging something. It's OneNote in the background, it's Notepad. I open up Notepad when I'm debugging stuff and I just type stuff into Notepad. Like people have sticky notes. There were devs that just has sticky notes. I think Bill's one of them. Like Bill does this. He has sticky notes next to him, and he'll write things on sticky notes. And then like throughout the course of a day, if you're debugging a hard bug, just have a pile of sticky notes or a Notepad window that if you get a crash, you lose all of your things because you put it in Notepad because you're me and you're lazy and don't want to use a real editor. And we had talked about this from the angle of like tying it to TTD or tying it to something else, where like you have these escalation engineers that could go. Jason Epperly is one of them, where like he works on a lot of the like end-to-end Windows things where it's like, you know, the kernel has a problem due to 7 things unrelated. It could hand off between 4 or 5, 6 different teams, multiple escalation engineers, and you have so much redone work where it's like, Tim told me this thing broke in this way. I want to double check. And then they do the same work that you just did, where if you could share your notes in a way that tightly integrated, you could have your highlighting in the command window. You could have all of that copy over and carry over, and you could get some of that. That's the thing that I think I would want to push on more, and I could justify if we had the right thoughts through it.
Yeah, it's funny that a lot of the stuff that we did with notes and trying to capture knowledge, I've been thinking about that ever since, and some of that actually is stuff that I'm bringing into the startup that I'm working on, which is Augment. I'm not going to plug that here, but just about how to capture and understand. Like that's a hard problem to solve.
Yeah,
but yeah. So what would you have changed? Would you have put more effort onto it, prioritize it more, or?
Yeah, I think it kind of ties into like more effort to be more bold, maybe, because we did a good job, like 1-for-1 replacing WinDbg. We plus 6 years, like 1-for-1 replacing. But I think there were times where we were like, we had talked about one of the early things we talked about when we were thinking about, back to what the first topic of this was, we looked at like VS, we had looked at rewriting, we had looked at redoing. We had talked about like, can we just build a debugger around TTD, time travel debugging? It only has to look at a time travel debugging trace. How can we do things different there? And that's one where like notes would have been such a big differentiator and that type of stuff. So more of like being more bold probably would have been there, but that's
think outside the main,
think outside of the standard things, and we did a pretty good job of that in some cases. If you're debugging time travel debugging traces, the timeline window is absolutely awesome and very rarely used and valuable. The model window is another one where we had these experiences that we did outside the box, but most people don't use them because they stick to what they're used to doing, and maybe they grow a little bit, maybe they do it, but it's a difficult problem to get people to use things that are different when they're trying to. Generally, when you're debugging something, you want to just get it done and move on with your life. You don't want to spend time learning debugging.
Yeah, I wish we had spent more time integrating some of those things into people's regular workflows. And, maybe the team is still thinking about some of these things, but, all of the data model stuff, for example, there's an incredibly powerful experience that's hard to scratch the surface of if you don't know it's there. And I think that it would have been great if we had integrated, like, figure out what people's normal workflows are. Like, they're typing LM to list the modules. That should be linking into the data model. That should be linking into the modules window in WinDbg and like that. And those are the things where I feel like I wish we had spent a little bit more time on, because we could have, even for people that are not exploring new features, people that are happy to stay within their use cases, we would have been able to give them a more powerful experience. That's probably my biggest, I wish we had done a little bit more there.
Yeah, but both of those are things that still could be done.
It could be done.
Yeah. What I would do different. Yeah.
You and I are not on the team anymore, so hint, hint. Anybody on the WinDbg team?
Yeah, I'm sure they're watching the hour of us talking about this.
About stuff they know very well. Okay, so that there's regretting some decisions, but what's the favorite decision that we made? What's for you?
Ribbon.
Ribbon?
No, not Ribbon.
Okay.
It's a hard one. Doing it. Its existence. That's a cop-out answer.
It is.
What's yours?
Mine? Oof. I think it's the way that we did automatic updates. Because I was, for myself and for I think a lot of the people that worked on it early, I think it was me and Nick, I think, that were working on it the most in the early days. It was very motivating for us to be able to fix something and get an update out quickly to people. Like, we were just energized by that. And I think part of that, and when I say the automatic updates, it's not just the fact that we can push updates out to people. It was the fact that we had really good tests, that we could have confidence that we could go and make changes quickly and not be worried that we're going to go and break something. We treated it much more like a CI/CD type of service deployment than we did treat it like a shrink-wrapped product. And I think that was probably the single biggest thing that was good, because it led to so many other good decisions and so many other good, aspects.
Right. So in that angle, my favorite thing was all the user research, which is directly tied to that. I was able to get so much user research off of someone saying, "Hey, I don't like this," or "I like this," and me being able to say, "Cool, can I stop by and follow up?"
Yeah.
And so many people were not used to it. So that, I've said it a few times now, but that was so much.
Yeah. And you got those opportunities partly from our feedback system too.
Right. Yeah. So one, it was fun. I like doing that work in that way. I don't do much real user research now. I own an API surface. I don't get to go talk to people about their UI. But I really like that interaction. And the key part of it for me is I dislike that we were able to be such a small and quick scale. I didn't need to do a formal user research study that had a bunch of stuff and red tape around it, and I had to write out a bunch of proposals. It was we got to sit down. I got to go to user research, talk to 5 people, literally in the same aisleway. I would schedule it so I talked to 5 people in the same aisleway, work on the same product, work on the same thing, and then type you a Teams message on my way back to the office saying, "Hey, we should do this." And then I'd get there and you would either already be thinking about it or fighting me on it, or be like, "Yeah, I just done." And then I could follow up on that. So it's in the same vein, but it's a step further away from the getting to talk to people so quickly, getting to be able to react to it so quickly, which is partially due to the feedback, but it's also partially due to just the way that we were able to operate with how it all started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I realized that, we've kind of been talking about it as if it was Andy and I made this, but obviously there were so many people that were involved with this. While, the UI itself, there were maybe a dozen people over the course of 7 years or so that worked on it. there was a lot of supporting features, you know, all the people that were working the core side of the engine that really contributed to it. But yeah, like the people that worked on it that had really done a lot, you know, on our team, it was, you know, we had Nick and we had Estefania and we had Teddy and we had a bunch of people that you know would contribute little bits. Some people that would contribute huge chunks. Estefania had the task of porting our .NET code from .NET 4.6 to .NET 6, which was a monumental task, and that was just amazing when that got finished. That was only 2 years ago. 2 years ago? Does that sound right? It was when when .NET 6 was released.
That was like I've been on WebView 2 for 2 years.
Oh, so you were working on that. That was while you were still on the in the debugging space. Yeah. So anyway, like I don't want to sound like it was just like, you know, Andy and I that did this. It was a huge number of people that contributed to this, and of course, people across the company at Microsoft that did as well.
Yeah.
As well as a couple of people that reverse engineered our code, figured out some bugs, and then told us on Twitter, and then we would go and fix that. That happened like twice. Yeah. Once was a performance problem in the text window. I was very appreciative that somebody had gone and done some research.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just looking at my laptop because I was trying to scroll through and figure out if someone had, like, there was once, I think someone wanted us to talk about TTD more, but I think that's probably a follow-up.
Yeah.
Like history of TTD. Yeah. What else did we read? Anything else that we want to talk about?
No, I think we pretty much covered all of it. Yeah, I mean, if anybody has any questions, let us know on Twitter. I'll put a link to Andy and my Twitter handle.
Or Mastodon.
Mastodon.
If you want to let us know on Blue Sky, send us an invite.
Yeah. Invite, please.
Please, can we put that in the front?
Yeah. So yeah, hopefully you found this interesting. You know, Andy and I, we spent a very large chunk of our professional career, so it's kind of like really close to our hearts. And I know a lot of people, you know, appreciate the work that we did, and we appreciate all the feedback.
To tack on to your previous thing, we said it, but people are still working on it. There's still this.
Yeah, it's not over.
Like, there's still the same amount of people working on it and making progress. And
we're just not involved anymore.
Yeah, we're just not involved. Yeah. So we're looking back at it as if it's a point in time, because it's a point in time in our lives.
And it is in some ways, you know, a huge milestone. It's out of beta. It's no longer a preview, and I'm sure there will be more investments. But I think, you know, it is in a different phase of its life cycle as a product for sure. So
yeah,
cool. Well, thanks everybody for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. Let us know if you liked it on Twitter and comments. Yeah, thanks for watching.
Thanks everyone.